Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at the Federalist, a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, and expert on all things American politics, which is what we talked about today. We spoke about the fallout from the Dobbs decision, how the American right feel about pronatalist policy, and also the figure of Donald Trump and the extent to which he represents a new post-Christian right that is emerging in America. We spoke in the extended version even more about the new right, and particularly about the new right's relationship to women and the misogynist streak that may cause some problems in terms of attracting female support. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Emily, can we start by talking about abortion? Because you wrote a really interesting piece last year, actually, when the Dobbs judgment was leaked, about class and abortion, and about the slightly unexpected relationship between income and attitudes towards abortion. Because one of the big arguments against Dobbs was from the pro-choice position was that it would mean that poor women are more likely to get abortions. Poor women are more likely to therefore have to travel out of state in order to access abortion. This was an assault on poor women, essentially. But you wrote a very interesting piece about what poor women actually think about abortion in general.
Yeah, the intersection of media and class is something that I'm increasingly interested in because it's one of the things that actually got me interested in media in the first place. Not that I grew up in a pretty middle class, like normal upper middle class, if anything, but just being outside of a major city. I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin, about 40 minutes outside Milwaukee, and seeing the way that Hollywood and journalists especially depicted Christian conservative gun owners and all of that is actually one of the things that made me want to go to DC. And post Trump, this has just been on display every single day. And I think it was on display after the Dobbs decision was leaked, because the left has tried to own this argument that it's the right that has some sort of blind spot on class when it comes to abortion. But whenever the left represents the sort of working class position on abortion, they actually give very little representation to the fact that support for abortion declines as your annual economic station declines. So as income declines, so too does support for abortion. And that's for all kinds of reasons. Religion is one of the biggest parts of that. But yeah, I mean, it's true that, poor women are most likely to find themselves in these positions. And, that's obviously creates blind spots just in terms of there aren't a lot of journalists who have ever lived off of food stamps or welfare or have, endured poverty. That's absolutely true. There are fewer journalists that have been in a position where they felt like they had to get an abortion because they couldn't pay for a child that they really wanted. That's a very different experience than, being 22 and saying, I don't want this child, which is a position that a lot of sort of upper middle class journalists find themselves in, or upper class journalists find themselves in. And I think that really affects the way people look at the issue. And it does. I mean, when we look at polling, it absolutely does. So it's frustrating to watch the media, I think, kind of launder its opposition or its support for abortion as the position of or as something that has solidarity with the working class or with middle America or with people in inner cities, when actually it's not true. They tend to be in bubbles that are more supportive of abortion. And also there's just a very different experience. Even if you are someone who's had an abortion, supports generally the right to get an abortion, people's experiences with abortion are completely different based on class. And so it's a blind spot, but it's one of the more frustrating blind spots because it's one that's treated like the opposite of a blind spot, like something that's hyper aware and conscious of class, when actually it's just as ignorant as basically every other position the media has from a class perspective.
So is it simultaneously true that poorer women are more likely to to have abortions, but also more likely to oppose abortion on moral grounds.
Right. I
Yeah.
think that's broadly true, and the support for abortion is so hard to nail down in polling
Mm,
because uh, people calling themselves pro-choice versus pro-life is different than people supporting late-term abortion, and it's different than people
hmm.
supporting really early, before 12 abortion before 12 weeks, which most of America supports abortion up until, I don't know, roughly like 12 weeks. And then it gets a little different as you approach 20 weeks. And then most of the country does not support it basically after that third trimester abortion. So it always depends on the way it's asked. And it always depends on how we're kind of defining the terms. But I think broadly it's true that yes, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to oppose abortion, but also the more likely you are to have found yourself in a situation where you're trying to access abortion.
I once read this study, although I can't remember exactly the authors or date or anything, but I think this holds true in both Britain and America, that poorer women are more likely to have an unwanted pregnancy because they use contraception less often and less well. Richer women are less likely to have an unwanted pregnancy because they use contraception more frequently and more effectively. But when they get pregnant and they don't want to be, rich women are more likely to get abortions, poor women are more likely to keep the baby. And I don't know if that's because of different moral attitudes towards abortion, possibly, given what you're saying. It may also be that the opportunity costs in terms of income from having, and in terms of career progression from having a baby, too young for a richer woman are more profound. So she's more motivated to end the pregnancy, or I don't know, seeking out abortion services requires more. I don't know. There seems like a whole. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the kind of abortion and class and income nexus.
I think that's exactly right. And in the States, we have a huge class in lower income brackets of very religious Hispanics. For example,
Mm,
Catholics, faithful Catholics, for whom abortion is really not an option. So there's that, and we also have the people in our inner cities, whether they're Hispanic, whether they're Black, or people in rural areas, maybe who are in Appalachia and are white, for whom abortion is also, in many cases, very taboo, not an option, is out of line with their religiosity. So there's definitely an element of that, but also I think your point about careerism is hugely important. That if you are a upper middle class educated woman whose sort of entrance into the working world was facilitated by the filter of higher education, and you went through all of the women's studies classes and the sort of social conditioning about when it's appropriate to have children, and you've sort of been really conditioned to overcome a lot of the feminine in the way that you've written really beautifully about, overcome not just the feminine but almost the human. Then yes, you're sort of very averse to this idea in your 20s when you're probably having a lot of sex. And well, I guess if you're Gen Z, but and maybe
we
before
can get
that,
onto that.
yeah, maybe
Yeah.
before that, when at least a section of young women are having a lot of sex, and in a lot of cases it's unprotected, you're probably also going to be more averse to having a baby for career reasons and for just the reasons of social conditioning. And as we see, more affluent countries are having lower birth rates. There's basically very few exceptions to that, and it's a very hard trend to reverse for all kinds of reasons, again, that you've written about. But I think that's absolutely accurate. There are a lot of women tend to be more religious and at least more traditional the lower you go down sort of socioeconomic brackets, and they want those kids. And some of the most heartbreaking stories are of women who regret abortions that they got because they couldn't pay for a baby.
And that's a facet of, well, look, a criticism sometimes made by the pro-choice side, let's say, in the pro, I mean, it is worth reiterating what you mentioned earlier, that actually there's a remarkable degree of unanimity among American voters and indeed British voters on what abortion policy should be. Like, actually, the modal position is very widely held, is basically before 12 weeks is okay, and then with some exceptions afterwards. Like the pro-choice and pro-life positions are quite small extreme minorities on both sides. But one criticism made by the pro-choice side of the pro-life side is that you've got a lot of, say, Christian conservatives who are very motivated to prevent abortions, but then don't care a whole lot about the kids once they're born. That's not true of all pro-life advocates at all. There is also a push to offer financial assistance to women who would otherwise have abortions because they can't afford to have another child and so on. Because that is a poverty is at least given as the primary reason for having an abortion in an enormous number of cases in the States, right?
Yeah, and I think pro-life people like myself, obviously, I actually think this was kind of a blind spot for the conservative movement for a while, because you sort of look at the culture and say it is shocking that we are in a position culturally, especially if you're coming at it from a religious perspective, that we've become so numb to the level of death that takes place in this country every year. Through abortion. And that's what's kind of the focus, that like we actually want to take care of point A before point B, because point A is so shocking and is such a sad statement on the culture. And then point B, which is a much more immediate material concern for women who are seeking abortions every single day, and maybe regretfully and hesitantly gets overlooked, because point A, you feel so heavy and grave, and immediate because it's severe, that you never think about point B. You're too focused on kind of the root problem, which is actually the opposite of how politics works a lot of times. But you've seen like Ron DeSantis, for example, like start to make diapers. I think he's made them like refundable on taxes. And you've seen some like really innovative approaches to this post Dobbs that absolutely should have been a much bigger priority and focus of the conservative movement and the pro-life movement pre-Dobbs. And that is, it's actually hard. It's another really frustrating thing about being sort of on the right in America, is that some of the stuff actually has been going on for years. There have been conversations about this going on for years on the right, but to penetrate the media bubble, you have to be so loud about some of this stuff. They're never going to cover Republican politicians or pro-life groups that are working to make babies more affordable, because it's not even on their radar. I mean, media doesn't pick those stories up, and they certainly don't pick them up in a big headline type way, unless you are really making it like the central focus and are blaring it from the rooftops and are putting lots of effort into public relations campaigns highlighting it. It'll just get left out of the narrative. It's not convenient for the narrative. It doesn't make it into the bubble anyway. So it has to be a bigger focus if you want to, convince people that you're coming at this from a genuinely compassionate perspective. You have to do something major to, I think, disrupt the broader media narrative that it's a Handmaid's Tale situation about controlling women's bodies. And conservatives who were interested in point B for a long time and were thinking about it didn't do enough to disrupt that narrative, and didn't do enough about point B anyway. So yeah, I think it's a real problem. And it's also frustrating because the sort of fusionist conservative movement that brought together the religious right with the neoconservatives and the small government kind of libertarian conservatives really became interested in prioritizing small government, limited government, I should say. And that is difficult. What Ron DeSantis did with diapers, for example, post-Dobbs, pre-Dobbs would have been a lot harder because of the centrality of the limited government plank in the modern conservative movement.
Although, if what he was proposing was making them is giving tax exemptions, shouldn't that be permissible? That's not government handouts, right? That's letting parents keep their own money and spending it on their children.
You'd think. One interesting thing when you talk to people who are involved in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, so like one of the big legislative accomplishments of Donald Trump, is they were working really hard, people in Senator Rubio's office, Senator Lee's office, to make the child tax credit. They tried to double the child tax credit. They tried to make it refundable on payroll tax, all of that stuff. This sort of like nerdy, wonky stuff, but basically that would benefit the working class. It was a really uphill battle for them, and they didn't get everything that they wanted. pre-Dobbs. This is 2017, and it's still kind of unthinkable that Roe would ever fall at this point, even it being so recent in our history, because it's seen as kind of a government intervention in the family life in the private sector. And I actually think that would be totally different now. But at least just 6 years ago, if you talk to those people, they'll give you war stories of having these conversations with other Senate offices and trying to convince them that it's a conservative thing. If you're going to be giving tax benefits, if you're writing into the tax code benefits for businesses, my goodness, like, give a little bit something more to these parents.
I mean, I find that so peculiar because, I mean, not that we don't have the same issues here, I guess, but I mean, my preference always when it comes to pronatalist policy, and even though I know that it works out pretty much the same for the recipients, but I would always rather have a tax cut rather than have a government handout, because I do kind of agree with Reagan's thing about,
Oh, yeah.
I'm from the governor, I'm here to help. I do have a suspicion of big government, right? I think it's like an essentially American aspect of my character, which is slightly unexpected, but I think that this is parents' money and they should get to keep it and they should get to spend it on their children. It seems to me that should be something that people could come together and agree on, particularly on the right. That doesn't seem to be the case, though. I'm guessing it's partly because there's a deep aversion to be seen to pay the underclass to have children. Like I think I read the Daily Mail comments on any article about pronatalist policy, and that's the thing that alarms some populist voters. Maybe that's what it is, although I don't think that is likely actually to happen with tax cuts, because people pay more tax the more income they have. So if anything, you end up disproportionately benefiting
And that's
middle class and upper middle class parents.
That's why people were working really hard to make it payroll tax deductible, because if you
Right, yeah.
it's just, that's actually kind of interesting. I mean, I think a lot of it is this paranoia that has been kind of ingrained in people's minds about, that's private or an intervention in the private business sector versus an intervention in the family life. That, and this is something I actually think the new right gets wrong a lot of times. And I'm still of two minds actually about child tax credits for this reason, that it gives the government leverage to, in the same way that you're asking the government to incentivize family creation and to incentivize child rearing and to, encourage people to have more kids. They can use those levers. They can say, if you're going to be if your child is going to qualify, if your family qualifies for child tax credit, someday down the road, they could say it only counts if they're vaccinated, or it only counts if you
attend drag queen story hour once a month or whatever. Yeah.
Right. And the parent,
I'm joking, but I can see the reasoning there.
Yeah. You never know what direction it goes in. And there's a lot of paranoia about that on the American right, but there's also, I think, a lack of awareness on the new right that has pushed some government interventions at how plausible that is, especially in the aftermath of COVID and 2020, when we saw, exactly how quickly things can go in a bad direction.
Yes, I think it is certainly true that if there's anything we've learned from maybe the last decade of political events, is that it is definitely fighting culture war through apparently mundane policy happens all the time. and it's completely possible to. I had Poppy Coburn on the podcast a little while ago, who's a British journalist, you may know, and we were discussing some very obscure elements of government policy relating to charities and how they have been used essentially for the British government to fund lobbying against the British government's interests, like at scale. Like, so many charities in the UK have basically been able to use a loophole which permits them to do political lobbying if and only if they're doing so on behalf of like oppressed groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, they've done so with vigor. And we've ended up in this bizarre situation where it's impossible, because oppressed groups is obviously, the whole concept is a leftist concept. You can't apply that rule to, say, advocating on behalf of like I don't know, the native population against immigration, or taxpayers against, I don't know, like any kind of right wing cause. You can't possibly utilize that that rule. But the left have done an absolutely amazing job, to be fair to them, with organising on that principle, and the British government is like stunned.
See, that's so interesting to me because one of the, like, I've been on this odyssey over the course of the last year, sort of reading a lot of Cold War history. And it's amazing how the presentism that we use to look back on the Cold War has enshrined as like the gospel that people were paranoid with no kind of rational understanding of the threat. And when you sort of go back and you look, I mean, for like Oppenheimer is a great example, just like cavorting with Soviet spies and then put in charge of the nuclear program. Like, that's crazy. And people had every right to be a little bit freaked out by it. Now, it doesn't mean that they acted rationally in response, but I think a lot of the stuff that was written in the early part of the 20th century, responding to Lenin and then to Stalin and to sort of these movements that were springing up around the world, were looking at like very clear blueprints to do exactly what you just described. And it's prescient when you look back on it, like the way that, you know, government was going to be leveraged to create this post-industrial utopia that stripped humans of agency and control. And we do see that sort of actually like creeping into, it's like we're the frogs in the boiling pot. And suddenly we wake up one day and it's like, oh, I guess, you know, this random piece of legislation that Richard Nixon signed is being used to make sure everybody gets a new vaccine within like a year. It was the OSHA that Richard Nixon signed that Biden cited his original vaccine mandate to. And vaccine mandates are different than these other cultural things, but I think it was an example of how that can be used. And it's amazing the degree of, just back to your original question about why the right is resistant and has for too long been resistant to kind of government intervention that might provide a safety net for women interested in abortions. There was this whole gargantuan infrastructure that sprung up in response to the communist threat, but then also on the left, these like massive non-governmental infrastructures that sprung up in response to the Cold War threat that are now kind of like just old and you know, just these behemoths that still exist and have this muscle memory to freak out over absolutely everything that either smells of, you know, government intervention or of the private sector. And this is where we see like kind of the realignment happening, like kind of Matt Taibbi's and, you know, all of these people sort of saying like, wait, this old order doesn't really make sense anymore. The Marco Rubios, this doesn't make sense. We have to rethink some of these things, but it's still hard to break the muscle memory that both the left and the right have in these like old hulking infrastructures in our political space.
Let's talk more about the realignment. So tell me what you mean within the American context by the realignment, and indeed the new right. This nice, easy opening definitions.
It really started, I mean, it's as kind of straightforward as a lot of people think it is. It started with Donald Trump suddenly coming on the stage talking about immigration and trade and the media, and winning margins that Republicans haven't won by in years. A lot of Obama voters in these hollowed out Rust Belt, you know, kind of the cliche states in the middle of the country, places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin. You just saw Donald Trump putting numbers up that shocked people. Michigan. Nobody really saw it coming. And he actually won a lot of former Obama voters that perhaps a 2007 version of Hillary Clinton won in the presidential primaries back in 2007 when she was doing her sort of Rust Belt, working class, blue collar Hillary act. And that really was a wake up call for a lot of people on the right. Some of it's been cynical. Some of it's just been like, hey, we were pimping free market economics for years, and now we see where, you know, Trump voters are, and we want to hop on the bandwagon, but we're not actually, when push comes to shove, going to want to do anything but cut taxes, all of that. But what we've seen is the conservative movement, much more than the progressive movement, be willing to have some of these conversations about what as a lot of people in the new right call it, Con Inc., the sort of broader conservative movement, this constellation of nonprofit groups and media organizations. For example, Tucker Carlson just a couple of weeks ago came out and said he thought William F. Buckley had done a lot of evil. That's like 10 years ago. If he had said that as a part of this constellation, you started the Daily Caller, would have been a shock to the system of the conservative movement, but was kind of just, everyone sort of expects it from Tucker Carlson, who's arguably the most popular person on the new right and in the conservative movement more broadly right now. I mean, when nonprofit organizations have Tucker Carlson speak at a gala, those things are packed. He's probably the most like in-demand speaker in the conservative movement right now, a very powerful person who's going after the father of the conservative movement historically, which is William F. Buckley. And it's just expected at this point. That's kind of how serious the shock to the system has been. And obviously, I do think conservative infrastructure still is hulking and has this muscle memory. But, in the span of 4 or 5 years, a lot of this has changed really quickly. And there's been a lot more attention paid to how conservatives can A, appeal to, and B, better serve middle class, working class Americans. What were the blind spots? How can they be corrected now? And this conservative movement, to its credit, was on top of the culture war for decades, but the Republican Party was not. And the conservative movement never convinced the Republican Party successfully to actually represent the cultural interests of its own base. For example, on the abortion issue, one thing that I remember, I was like on air when the Dobbs decision came down with my co-host Ryan Grimm, who's on the left. And thing a lot of people on the left get wrong, I was like, there are a bunch of people at the RNC right now who are quaking in their boots, like the official Republican Party, who are terrified and upset at the Supreme Court for overturning Roe. And people who are, in a position to know, people who were at the RNC at that time period have confirmed to me that that's exactly what happened. And it's not surprising to anybody who's followed the conservative movement closely. They just never convinced them to care about the cultural interests of their base. That changed in 2020. So as the economic stuff, trade, immigration was shifting, 2020 comes along and reinvigorates the conservative movement's sort of culture war push. And that's all kind of what's in the mix right now as the right broadly kind of tries to figure out what it should be post-Trump. You see a lot of people on the left, starting to find common ground with people again, like Matt Taibbi and figures of the left that they never would have found common ground with before. I don't think the left has absorbed those lessons, partially because their muscle memory is almost firmer because they have the media to back them up. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of the weird stuff that's been going on since 2015.
Yeah. So why would establishment conservative figures have been upset by Dobbs? Because there was that dog catching the car problem of oh gosh, now we actually have to legislate around this at the state level, or is there some other reason why that would have been actually unwelcome in more establishment circles?
They were totally right. I mean, they were right because their interests are power. Because they, like Mitch McConnell, is somebody who I think almost transparently thinks like this, that if the Republican Party can consolidate power, almost like it's a game, if you can rack up the most points, meaning the most seats and the most success across the country just in elections, then, ultimately everything can fall into place. And when your day-to-day is bogged down in fundraising and whipping votes, I think it's easy to see why he's, after decades in the business, come down with that mindset. But if it's a question of, consolidating power, then Dobbs was always going to be a disaster for the Republican Party. And I think we've seen that transpire over the last couple of years. We've seen that illustrated in elections across the last couple of years. And I don't think anybody in the pro-life movement is surprised by that. I think, they realized that and knew right away they were going to have a huge lift when it came to messaging and elections. But the sort of Mitch McConnell establishment conservative Republicans at the RNC, when Dobbs came down, were right to say this is a huge impediment going forward, towards our quest for power. And they were right.
Because it motivates a pro-choice lobby to push harder against Republicans in particular seats, or I mean, another question, right? I mean, my view on why abortion is important in American politics in particular is because it's basically indicative of Christianity. You know, the Christian position on abortion is a very clear one. It's also a very unusual one among historically and among other religious traditions. If you're, you know, basically if you're restricting abortion, then you are insisting on the government being more Christian, and vice versa, right? So what you're really arguing about is basically whether America should continue to be a Christian state. And what's so interesting, though, in this whole thing is that Donald Trump, who is indicative of the new right and is, you know, was instrumental in Dobbs, he's not really a Christian figure at all. And he has, my understanding is that he has managed to harness the support of the Christian right, but it's a slightly fragile coalition because it's fairly apparent. I mean, hasn't he refused to answer the question of whether or not he's ever paid for an abortion? Because we all kind of assume the answer is yes.
And he's refusing to answer questions right now about what his policy would be on a 15-week ban or a 6-week ban.
Right.
He says, we'll get to a solution that's good for everyone.
So how is he? Is he playing like 4D chess with us? Does he know that actually he can get away with losing the support of, say, evangelical leaders? Or actually is he, I don't like, my question is basically, what proportion of voters on the right, particularly this kind of populist right MAGA base, actually are Christians and actually care about abortion on like in as indicative of their Christian faith?
Mm-hmm. So it's a super interesting question. I think probably if I had to put a number on it, I would say of the Republican coalition, I would say is like 30% evangelical Christian, so sort of fits the stereotype. It might even be less than that, 20 to 30% evangelical Christian that fits the stereotype of charismatic and political in a way that a lot of the Protestant churches in America aren't, you know, so overtly politicized, but like neatly fits into that. Probably another 20% is Catholic, including a lot of Orthodox Catholics that are very serious about their anti-abortion stances. So I think what he knew, which is really interesting, is that people were so upset about the country in general that if he presented himself as the general bulwark against secular cultural decline, sort of that slide into an unfamiliar secular culture. And this is happening really fast in the West. And, you know, there are people on the left and the right who speak to it, populists on the left and the right who speak to it, you know, whether it's, you know, whether it's in Holland, whether it's in the US, whether it's, you know, in the UK. And I think he
it's a global vibe.
It's a global vibe. You should write another book called Global Vibe. But totally, like Trump realized that if he could, first and foremost, if he could say his first and foremost priority is stopping that, and gave a little bit to the anti-abortion part on the right, he realized that everyone's priority, more than anything else, basically every person who's anti-abortion is anti-abortion, to your point, because it's a proxy for this broader slide into secularism that terrifies a lot of people, whether they go to church every Sunday or not. If you talk to a lot of people at Trump rallies, they are not people. In fact, my old editor, Tim Carty, wrote a fascinating book called Alienated America, where he posited and then sort of successfully fleshed out this theory that in the Republican primary in 2015 and 2016, where people were more likely to support Donald Trump is where civil society was less prominent. So if you're in this hollowed out,
the bowling alone kind of thesis,
it was totally a follow-up to bowling alone, and explicitly so. Yeah. And if you went into some of these, if you went into like Dutch communities in Wisconsin that were really tight-knit, they were supporting Ted Cruz. Mormon communities in Salt Lake City and in Utah, they were supporting Ted Cruz. It was the sort of places in rural America where the pews are empty on Sundays and there are no bowling leagues that were way more likely to support Donald Trump. So if you talk to people at Trump rallies, you'll talk to a lot of people that don't go to church every Sunday for many different reasons. But what they do sort of innately feel is that they're very upset about sort of secular liberals and atheists and all of that, because they recognize that this is about something deeper. So if you sort of appeal and say, we'll get you all the Supreme Court justices you want, you don't have to say, I'm going to have a 6-week ban on abortion federally. And I think Donald Trump, as a populist who came to this from outside the Republican Party, he knows that the pro-life position is broadly unpopular because of conditioning through, Hollywood and all of that over the course of years. And that's what freaked people out about Dobbs, is that like it's seen as kind of an icky religious position to be extremely anti-abortion. Donald Trump knew that. So that's where he kind of understood better than a lot of people who had been in Republican politics and the conservative movement for decades, coming from the outside, as somebody who's somebody of popular culture, of Hollywood. He had a hit TV show. He understood that better than I think the right ever did.
It's his amazing talent, isn't it, as a public figure, that he can sort of intuit the popular will.
Totally.
In a way that the vast majority of politicians can't do. And I mean, and to that, do you think that suggests that, so my understanding, although you'll know better than me, is that America has not slid towards secularism anywhere near as quickly as Britain and the rest of Europe, but it is sliding towards secularism nonetheless, and devout Christians tend to be older. With some exceptions, of course, younger generations coming up tend to be less pious. Do you think that Donald Trump might be correctly intuiting a slide on the right in America towards being more post-Christian, and the evangelical wing in particular having less influence?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think you heard a lot of platitudes in the conservative movement in prior decades about how the country was conservative, and there's just when people would talk about the silent majority, it wasn't necessarily with the nuance probably that the silent majority doesn't mean that they're all pious Christians, but it means that they're sort of average people, and average people are increasingly less religious. And Donald Trump knew that because he had a hit TV show that was watched by average people. And there are, before he was really a politician, there were, pieces written about how popular Celebrity Apprentice and The Apprentice was with the Black community, that this was like something that reached people across the sort of spectrum of the American experience. And I do think there was a bubble. It's almost hard not. I mean, you can't really blame people in the conservative movement for being in a bubble, but they really were. I mean, I guess you can blame them for that. It's sort of their job to, if you say if you say you understand the country, and it's professionally your job to be good at that, then yes, I guess I can blame you. But it's hard, and I think that is what a lot of people lost is. When the Dixie Chicks insulted George W. Bush and people were stomping on their Dixie Chicks CDs or burning them, or radio stations were banning the Dixie Chicks, it sort of neatly fit into the stereotype. And I think Donald Trump at the time probably understood that wasn't a lot of born again Christians who were upset about, from the sort of Christian nationalist perspective, the Dixie Chicks, just being disloyal to the greatest country on earth. It was sort of actually this populist outrage at wealthy celebrities trashing the country that is sending poor kids to war overseas, people from their communities to Iraq. And here you have this like rich celebrity she was in London talking trash about the president. And I think if you had talked to Donald Trump at the time about that, he probably would have had a much more nuanced perspective than a lot of people in the sort of professional right would have back in, I think that was 2004.
The culture war is really a class war.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he's a rich guy, but his cultural instincts are working class. His taste, like the famous picture of him with all the McDonald's in the Oval Office, right? Like he doesn't have rich person tastes. Well, that's not quite right. He has like the taste of like a rapper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So right. Well, and
that's his whole persona.
He's helped me understand that America is really aspirational. And so it's almost offensive to be Mitt Romney rolling up the sleeves of your Brooks Brothers, $200 Oxford when you go to a factory. wear your suit. Wear a tuxedo for all everyone cares. All those guys they admire you, because there's sort of nothing more American than owning your success and sort of being a business person, an entrepreneur. And, the legitimacy of Donald Trump, who got big loans from his dad's claim to being an entrepreneur, is another thing. But that sort of public perception of him, and Mitt Romney could have tapped into that way better than he did. I mean, talk about somebody who was actually really very successful. And, I don't necessarily agree that he should have been making all this money in the private equity sector. And I have very little admiration for Mitt Romney, but the American people are like, you're running a presidential campaign. It's so gamified, and it's become such an entertainment piece now, that if he had, not rolled up those sleeves and had worn a suit and just owned it and not looked uncomfortable, but looked totally at peace with himself, he may have had a better chance. But the political sort of sanctimony of it's just so fake. And I think he understood that Americans, black, white, rich, poor, respect success more than anything, and you shouldn't try to hide it.
And that false humility about your success is a kind of an upper middle class preoccupation. That thing of being quietly wealthy but not, making a fuss about it. I'm reminded of when Boris Johnson, who is kind of there are a lot of differences, but he's kind of our Trump in the space he inhabits, although of course the difference is that he comes from multi-generational wealth. Well, I mean, I know Trump does too, but like Boris Johnson is posh, right? He's
Waspy.
he's aristocrat adjacent, but he also has this ability, probably not as good as Trump's, but he has an ability to intuit what working class people think. And one of the things he got in trouble for when he was prime minister was spending a lot of money, well, his wife spending a lot of money on doing up the flat in Downing Street, which is really quite a modest flat. It's not as nice as the White House by any means. And they got all this like gold wallpaper and stuff. And it was this enormous sort of scandal in the media class because it was seen as being spendthrift. But actually the response that you got mostly when I was listening to Talk TV or reading comments or whatever from working class Brits was like, of course our prime minister should have gold wallpaper. That's an appropriate way to recognize the importance of his office. It wasn't seen as being spendthrift, it was seen as being appropriately aspirational, as you say. And I think that, I think there's a gap in that understanding of wealth and success between the media class and very many voters.
And Trump did something that turned like decades of very self-serious political scholarship on its head when he went to the Iowa caucuses. And I think this was at the Iowa State Fair, which is the sort of, as a cliche, probably the most, it is the most cliched like presidential event in campaigning. Trump gave kids helicopter rides at the Iowa State Fair, which Mitt Romney could have afforded to do, but would never have done because his stiff, well-dressed consultants would have said, are you like, this is the dumbest idea I have ever heard. You are rubbing your wealth in the working class people of Iowa's faces. And that sort of, there's this idea of the center of the country of kind of having that Protestant work ethic and sort of putting their heads down and being quiet. But I don't think that's ever been right about America, and maybe Britain as well. Like this is about there's the beauty of capitalism is that success is a virtue because in all likelihood, it means that you worked your butt off and you kind of earned it. And that's not to say people who aren't successful didn't earn it, but if you are successful, generally you did. And yeah, it worked out for you. So it's just funny how that probably took him 10 seconds to think of that idea, and it upturned literally decades of very self-serious political scholarship about how to win Iowa in 10 seconds of a billionaire reality television host thinking it up on his own plane, probably.
So going back to Trump's relationship with the Christian right and indeed, I guess class and religion too. One of the other things that characterizes Donald Trump's personal life and also characterizes increasingly class distinctions in America and also in Britain and elsewhere is marriage, right? Like I think we all know that the group of people who are most likely to basically live like the 1950s, but preach the 1960s are the upper middle classes who are getting married later, but nevertheless getting married, staying married, having children within wedlock, etc. Whereas increasingly, the poorer you are, the less likely that is you are to do any of that. And maybe that's another way in which Donald Trump is more appealing than, say, someone like Mitt Romney, who is this incredibly like upstanding patriarch. I believe he has 25 grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something like that, right?
Yeah.
All within wedlock, etc. Like absolutely perfect kind of Christian ideals as represented in his personal life. Do you think that one of the other things that makes Trump attractive potentially is that he's also he's also flawed in that particular way?
Hmm. Yeah, it's more relatable almost that he's not
Right. Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually really interesting. I haven't really thought of that before, because there was the same thing with Ronald Reagan. Actually faced these questions about being divorced at a time
Mm.
when also it was important for Republican politicians to be seen as this bulwark against the slide into
Mm.
secularism. There was a lot of moral panic about it, and I would say probably reasonably so at the time, in a similar way that there is now, coming out of the 1970s, the 60s, and the 70s. And it didn't matter for Reagan. Reagan was totally fine with it. And it was almost seen in Republican circles in the decades after Reagan that was something Ronald Reagan really had to overcome. It's probably true that he really didn't have to overcome it, because everyone was starting, like, divorce was really becoming a
Yeah, that
normalized
was when it
thing.
was really spiking.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
you've written about that. Like, that's exactly the time period when it would be relatable to people that someone had a divorce, and almost comforting or validating to people that he had a divorce. And to your point, that was not experienced in the same way by the sort of the political consultant class, which, again, my former editor Tim Carney has called this the Lena Dunham fallacy, that you find, and the way that Girls Ends is a good example of this. Her show that I actually really love. They tend to have children. They tend to have children in wedlock, people in upper classes, while they prescribe to other people and normalize to other people things like divorce and premarital sex and promiscuity and all of this stuff.
The early seasons of Girls. Yeah.
Yes. And then
Yeah.
the finale of Girls is one of the strangest and like most haunting pieces of television. I won't spoil it. Like, it's a huge spoiler, obviously, but it ends in a way that sort of perfectly confirms this theory about how the upper class lives. And so I think a lot of people missed that, again, to your point, in a way that Trump totally exposed with very little thought or effort.
Mm. And no shame.
Not an
I mean,
ounce
this
of it.
is,
He was leaking
yeah.
it to the tabloids, famously.
Yeah.
Was leaking his own exploits to the tabloids and was profiting off of that. I mean, he's the most shameless when it comes to adultery and divorce, and didn't pretend to be anything otherwise.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.